Thank you. I'm going to stand. I can stand on this one. I don't have to stand. It's very exposing being on that one over there. I'm going to stand over here. I can't see the egg timer, which is perfect. I have 15 minutes starting now. Wreckage. We are, as a Supreme Court judge who I bumped into on the tube at Westminster Station yesterday afternoon on my way back from the Queen Elizabeth Centre, said, Philippe, we are well and truly fucked, aren't we? And it does seem that this country has followed a line from Iraq in 2003 to the events of last month, which is unbroken and which takes us really to the edge of a place in which plainly, from my perspective, someone working in the field of international law, senses that the country has, if not fallen off its perch, is about to fall off its global perch, is about to disintegrate as bits of it fall off. It could not be more serious, which is why I want to talk to you about the uplifting subjects of genocide and crimes against humanity. I've spent 7 years writing a book which was published last month. It's called East West Street, and it tells the story of one city in the Ukraine, Lviv, Lemberg, it's all the same place, 2 crimes, genocide and crimes against humanity, and 4 men, one of whom was my grandfather, who was born in Lemberg in 1904, but he moved to Vienna in 1914, married in 37, left in 39, and by the time I knew him, he was living in Paris, France. He was a Frenchman. He is the first person in the story, detective story. The second and third people are prosecutors at Nuremberg, one of whom invented the concept of genocide, Raphael Lemkin, the other invented the concept of crimes against humanity as legal terms, Hirsch-Lauterpacht. And the fourth man was Hans Frank, who was Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer and then Governor General of occupied Poland. And I debated with my wife as to whether to talk about that story or the other story, which is the story at a moment when we are looking deep into imminent wreckage, offers some light and some uplifting. And so that's the story that I want to tell you. It's a story that begins with a scrap of paper. You won't be able to see it very well on the screen. Oh, I've gone backwards. It's actually this piece of paper. When I went off to Lviv in 2010 for the first time, I asked my mother whether I could have access to my grandfather's papers. And I'd not seen those before. And out of 2 tatty old briefcases, small suitcases, came a mass of images. And one thing that I found was this tiny little scrap of paper. It was folded in half, and it has written on it in pencil, but in a very firm handwriting, Miss E.M. Tilney, Manuka, Bluebell Road, Norwich, Angleterre. And I said to my mother, who is this person? And she said she didn't know, and I pushed her a little harder, and she eventually said, well, maybe she was the woman who carried me from Vienna to Paris in the summer of 1939 and really who saved my life. And you didn't want to know more about her? I asked my mum. And she said, no, I thought it would be too difficult. But if you want to go and find out who it is, you do that. So that piece of paper lay amongst the papers for 70 years before I started digging into it. It took me 4 years to find out. I'm a barrister, I'm a litigator, I'm used to dealing with evidence and finding out what lies behind a document. And I started with a census in Norwich, the UK national census. And I found, amazingly, that in 1939, there were 5 women in Norwich called E.M. Tilney. Pretty remarkable. And I whittled them down. Slowly, I could exclude each one by age or for other reasons. And eventually, I settled on a Miss E.M. Tilney who was born in 1893. And I then did what many people do, which is to go onto the web and see what I could discover about this lady. We had really no information. I found she was born in 1893 in Norwich, and then I found she had disembarked from a boat that had come from Durban, South Africa, to Southampton. And then I found on the web a death certificate for a Miss E.M. Tilney, born in Norwich, England, in 1893. And the death certificate is one of those things that you get on the web where you get a zip code and you have to pay $6 to get access to who the person is. And I traced down the zip code, paid my $6, and with that got access to a group of family members living in Coconut Grove, Miami. And I rang the first person on the list, whose name was Germaine Tilney, who is herself about 80 years old, and she told me that her Miss Tilney had indeed died in 1974 in Miami, Florida, and she also put me in touch with her nephew, John Tilney, who told me very little except two things. She had been a missionary, and she hated Germans. Armed with those two pieces of information, I was then able to go into the missionary records that are also available on the web in various libraries and track down other indications that led me to a mission she had gone on in the late 1950s and early 1960s in South Africa. And from that, I learned from one of the documents that she had been also spending time in France, and she had been associated with French missions. From that, I was able to discover that Miss E.M. Tilney had been interned from 1940 to 1944 in Stalag 121 in Vittel. And from this, I was then able to discover her records, which then led me to her other family members, including her brother Bert, who was a preacher at the Surrey Chapel in Norwich. And from this, I was able to contact the Surrey Chapel in Norwich and discover that this Elsie Tilney was indeed the one and the same Elsie Tilney who had signed that scrap of paper. The person that I communicated with, the archivist of the Surrey Chapel, is here this evening, Rosamond Codling, and I'm incredibly pleased that you are here, Ros. And my mum is here also tonight. In the pamphlet for the Surrey Chapel, which Rosalind directed me to, we finally found a photograph of Elsie Tilney. This was the woman who brought my mother to safety, saved her life. I could have stopped the researches that I did in the summer of 1939 because I had the answer to the question that I wanted, who saved my mum's life. But I wanted to go further because there were aspects of the things that I'd seen in the archives that indicated to me that in the context of the absolute mayhem that had convulsed Europe in that period, this individual had done remarkable things. And beyond that, and even more remarkably, she had told no one about what she had done. The Tilneys of Miami had no idea about what I discovered and what I am about to share with you. She stayed on in Paris in 1940, saving a lot of non-Aryans, Jews and non-Jews, and bringing them to safety as part of her mission work. She was then, from the summer of 1941, interned at Stalag 121, and there she was held until September 1944 with 2,500 other women who were British, Canadian, and American. She became, as I discovered from a book by a remarkable lady some of you may have read, Sofka Skipwith, the Red Princess, who was also interned with her at Stalag 121. She engendered fear amongst the younger internees at Stalag 121. I went through Sofka's book. Sofka passed away some years ago. And I went through her book and identified every single name of a person who'd been with them in Stalag 121, and systematically, using the web and other means, tracked down every single one of these ladies and found finally one who was alive, Shula Trohman, living in Brittany. And when I found her, I immediately went over to France, met with her, and she told me the story of Elsie Tilney. Shula's story itself is remarkable. She was 19 when she was interned. She had been born in British Palestine. She was thought to have a British passport, and that's why, despite the fact she was living in Paris, she too was interned. But it was not indicated that she was Jewish. And she explained to me the terrible fear that she had of Elsie Tilney. Elsie Tilney was this elderly, scary spinster lady who worked with the camp commandant, Landhäuser, and she was in charge of all the records in the camp. And she explained to me how one afternoon in late 1941, in the camp, she came down a corridor. She saw Miss Tilney approaching her, and she thought, this is it, my time is up. She knows I'm Jewish. She knows that I'm going to be taken to another place. As the two ladies came down the corridor, Shula described to me how Miss Tilney stopped, knelt on her knees on the floor, took her hand and said to her, I know all about you. You are one of the chosen people, and I will look after you. Have no worries. And thereafter, Elsie Tilney offered a protective embrace to this young and rather frightened woman who had never forgotten what had happened. As the story emerged in 1943, 400 Jews arrived from the Warsaw Ghetto, and a year later it was decided by Adolf Eichmann that they would be sent to Auschwitz. Several committed suicide. You can read this in Sofka Skipwith's book instantly. Elsie Tilney, who was teaching two of them English, told them to dress up, two young men to dress up as women, and she hid them in her cupboard in her room for 6 months until the Americans arrived in September 1944 and liberated the camp. So this is a truly remarkable individual. I tracked down, with the help of Roz, some of the very elderly members of the Surrey Chapel who remembered going to Sunday school with Elsie Tilney in the 1930s, and they gave me extraordinary accounts of a truly remarkable individual. But then what I really wanted to know was what actually motivated Elsie Tilney. What was it about her that caused her to take the direction that she did? And I had a complex conversation with Rosamond and with the pastor at the Surrey Chapel, and they directed me to the archives, and in particular the sermons of David Panton in the 1930s. Vivid, vicious, strong, anti-Hitler sermons. But in particular, they directed me to one passage of Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 10, verse 1, which I will read to you. Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God is for Israel, that they may be saved. The chapel had a particular interpretation of that line, and Elsie Tilney took that line, and it directed her to save, I think, several dozen people in that period, in the late 1930s and in the early 1940s. And so the question arose in my mind, what truly had motivated her? Was it ideology, or was it something else? And I turned to a neighbour, a writer, Jeanette Winterson, who has some experience of dealing with people who come from that kind of evangelical background. And we spent quite a lot of time together trying to work out exactly what it was that had motivated Elsie Tilney. And Jeanette explained to me that this lady was not someone who was motivated in this instance by an ideology, but by a sense of basic humanity and compassion. As Jeanette put it, she cannot have been an ideologue. An abstract principle is not enough to be heroic. It has to be something which touches us emotionally and which is deeply motivated. She was, in Jeanette's words and my sense also, a deeply compassionate human person. If we then go more deeply into Paul's letter to the Romans, which is a controversial text and a very complex text, we begin to understand that in that work and in that line is the very core of the idea of the protection and well-being of the individual, what is at the heart of our modern system of human rights. And that, I think, is what motivated Elsie Tilney. And the reason I want to share that story today is we will, from tomorrow, have a Prime Minister who is committed to taking the United Kingdom out of the European Convention on Human Rights. We have a Prime Minister who is committed to taking forward a programme which will take the United Kingdom out of the European Union, even though she did not support that direction. And amidst the wreckage that we are now looking at, I think we have to confront the possibility that we are staring at the possibility of an even greater wreckage. The world that Elsie Tilney occupied, the world in which she silently carried out her acts of extraordinary compassion, for which I have to be personally grateful. I would not be here standing before you but for Elsie Tilney, is a world in which states were entirely free to kill, to maim, to disappear, to destroy. And what emerged from that terrible time was the modern system of international law that we have today. And what we are sensing is that it is on the cusp of being undone. And so my message to you is to be extremely alert about where we are heading and to agitate. The sense of compassion and strength and protection that people like Elsie Tilney adopted, and there must be many of them, is that sense that needs to be rekindled again, or we will find ourselves in a situation in which, having come out of the darkness, the headline, the title given by the New York Times to the story that I tell in East West Street, we will be plunged back into that darkness. And we see it, and we feel it, and we are aware. I have had people, my own students, coming to me in tremendous distress about the overt racism and racial abuse that they are now being subjected to on the streets of London. So let us imagine this story, imagine where we have come from, and make absolutely sure that we do not return into that darkness. Elsie Tilney stands as a model for what we must avoid. Thank you very much indeed.